What if I told you that there was a time when real knights would engage in duels to settle arguments? You probably wouldn't believe me, but it is actually true. There were even rules that they had to follow, and we're going to tell you about them today. So, stay tuned until the end of the episode. Welcome back, everyone! It's me, and today I'm going to talk about some boring history so that you can sleep like a baby. Now let's get started. In medieval Europe, a knight's honor was everything, and if someone accused them of being a coward or a bad fighter, they had no choice but to accept the challenge and fight a duel against them. But there were some rules that they had to follow. Instead, they wore special clothes for the occasion. This was so that if they were injured, their armor wouldn't dig into their skin. These clothes were usually made out of linen and were very comfortable. And speaking of injuries, there was also a rule that stated that if one of the fighters was injured, the other had to stop attacking him immediately. If he didn't, he would be disqualified. Of course, this rule wasn't always followed, but it was the right thing to do. I mean, imagine if you broke your opponent's leg and he couldn't move. You would just have to stand there while he bled out. That's not exactly honorable, is it? Another rule that knights had to follow was that they weren't allowed to fight dirty. This meant that they couldn't attack someone who was unarmed or who had given up. They also couldn't use weapons that were considered unfair, such as poisoned arrows or knives hidden under their clothes. Of course, there were always exceptions to this rule, too. After all, knights were human, and humans are capable of some pretty disgusting things. But what if you were a knight who didn't want to fight at all? Well, in that case, you could always hire a substitute. This was actually a common practice during the Middle Ages. A rich merchant, for example, who didn't want to get his hands dirty, could hire a professional duelist to fight on his behalf. Of course, this was quite expensive, but it was a small price to pay for not having to get your hands dirty. The Code of Chivalry was a set of rules that knights had to follow. It was a way of ensuring that they fought fairly and with honor. Some people think that the Code of Chivalry was just a bunch of nonsense. But it's important to remember that knights were soldiers. And like all soldiers, they needed to be able to trust each other. If they couldn't trust each other, then they would be vulnerable to enemy attacks. The Code of Chivalry helped to build trust among knights, and it also helped them to maintain order in medieval society. Without it, things could have been much more chaotic. Now, it's time to learn about jousting, which was one of the most popular sports during the Middle Ages. You might have heard of it before, but if you haven't, let me catch you up. In a nutshell, jousting was basically like a medieval version of horse racing. Knights would ride around a course as fast as they could, trying to avoid getting knocked off their horses by their opponents. Jousting was a dangerous sport, but it was also very exciting to watch. It was a test of skill and bravery, and the crowds would cheer wildly as the knights rode by. But how did these knights train for such an event? They didn't just show up to the race course one day and hope for the best. No! They trained for years to become the best jousters in the land. They would start by learning how to ride a horse. And don't think that was easy. Horses are big, powerful animals, and they can be very dangerous if they're not handled correctly. Once a knight had mastered the art of riding a horse, he would begin to learn how to joust. This was a long and difficult process, but eventually the knight would be ready to compete against other knights from all over the kingdom, and when the time came for the tournament, they would put on their armor and get ready to ride. The crowd would roar as the knights charged towards each other, and the sound of their lances crashing together would echo across the countryside. It was a sight to behold, and the winner would be celebrated for weeks afterwards. One of the most famous jousters of all time was Sir Lancelot, and you may have heard of him. He was a legendary knight of King Arthur's Round Table, and he was said to be the greatest jouster that ever lived. There was only one problem with this, though he was completely made up. There was never a real Sir Lancelot who went around jousting and winning tournaments. That was just a story that was created to entertain people. So why am I telling you this? Well, because it's important to be aware of your sources. Not everything you read or hear is true, and it's up to you to be critical and evaluate the information you come across. For example, when you're reading a book, it's important to consider who wrote it and what their motives were. Were they trying to tell the truth, or were they just making stuff up to sell books? This is something you need to be aware of when consuming any type of media, whether it's a news article, a YouTube video, or even a movie. It's important to be aware of potential biases and to consider the source of the information. It's also important to be aware of your own biases. We all have them, and they can affect the way we interpret information. For example, if you're a conservative, you may be more likely to believe a news article that's published by a conservative source, even if the information in the article is biased. So what can you do to protect yourself from misinformation? One thing you can do is to consult multiple sources. If you read an article that makes you angry or that you think is really interesting, check to see if other sources are reporting the same thing. You can also take steps to reduce your own bias. One way to do this is to be aware of your own political leanings and to try to avoid reading articles that confirm your beliefs. Instead, challenge yourself to read articles that present the other side of the argument. Be doing this ULL, be able to better understand the issue at hand, and ULL be less likely to fall victim to misinformation. Knights weren't the only ones who engaged in duels during the Middle Ages. Members of the clergy did it, and the rules they had to follow were even more brutal than those of the knights. It was normal for priests and friars to challenge each other to a sword duel, and sometimes it could get pretty violent. But there were some rules that they had to follow. For example, the two combatants had to agree to fight with swords, not with their fists, and they also had to agree not to kill each other. Of course, this wasn't always respected, but it was the right thing to do. After all, members of the clergy were supposed to be peaceful people. Another rule was that the duel had to take place in public. This was so that other members of the clergy could act as witnesses and make sure that their fight stayed fair. It also served as a warning to other people not to pick fights with members of the clergy. If a priest or a friar was challenged to a duel, he couldn't refuse without being seen as a coward. So most of them took up the challenge and fought. It was a test of their courage and skill, and the winner was often celebrated afterward. Of course, there were some famous cases of clergy members who refused to fight. One of the most famous cases was that of Martin Luther. When he was a young monk, he was challenged to a sword duel by a fellow monk who accused him of heresy. Luther refused to fight, and as a result, he was branded a coward. This helped to make him even more determined to reform the church. Though many historians believe that Luther was actually a pacifist, and that he would have fought back if he had been attacked. All right, now it's time for the bonus fact. And today's bonus fact is about one of the most famous knights of all time, King Arthur. According to legend, he pulled the sword Excalibur from a stone when he was just a young boy. This proved that he was the rightful king of England. Arthur was known for his bravery, his honor, and his skill in battle. He led his knights on many adventures, and they accomplished many great deeds. However, the legend of King Arthur is actually quite sad. In the end, Arthur's enemies got the better of him, and he was killed in battle. His knights were scattered and his kingdom was destroyed. So why do we still tell the story of King Arthur today? Well, it's because his story teaches us some important lessons about life. It teaches us about the importance of bravery, honor, and fighting for what's right. Even though Arthur's kingdom was eventually destroyed, his legend lives on in the hearts and minds of people all over the world. Thank you for watching. Bye.